My name is Maya Whitfield, and I was standing in a courtroom hallway in Chicago, holding a manila folder that could either save my nursing license or end my career forever, when the man across from me smiled like he already knew I was going to lose. 6 hours earlier, I had been washing blood off my hands in a hospital locker room, listening to two of my coworkers laugh about a voicemail they wanted me fired over. 6 months earlier, I had been sitting beside a dying billionaire's bed at 2 in the morning, holding his hand because no one else in that building had bothered to. And 6 days earlier, I had learned that Elliot Hargrove, a man worth an estimated $2.3 billion, had quietly rewritten his will 3 weeks before he died and had put my name in it. I hadn't asked for a cent. I hadn't even known the will existed until his lawyer called me. But by the time the story reached the hospital gossip chain, it had transformed into something else entirely. A nurse who seduced a dying man for his fortune. A predator in scrubs. A woman who deserved to lose everything she had spent 8 years building. What none of them knew, not the charge nurse who started the rumor, not the hospital administrator who used it to bury a secret of her own, not even Elliot's own daughter, who hated me on sight, was that I had kept records. Every conversation, every voicemail, every strange instruction Elliot had given me in his final weeks, instructions that made no sense to me at the time, but would make devastating sense later. They thought I was a nobody, a nurse who got lucky, a woman they could push around because I never pushed back. They were about to find out how wrong they were. 8 months before that hallway, I was working nights in the cardiac step-down unit at Lindqvist Memorial, the kind of hospital that put its name on billboards and pretended the people who kept it running were interchangeable. I had been a nurse for 8 years by then, and I had learned early that the fastest way to survive in a place like that was to stay quiet, work hard, and never give anyone a reason to notice you. It didn't matter. Some people don't need a reason. Her name was Renata Cole, and she had been charge nurse on nights for longer than I'd been employed there. Renata had a gift for making you feel small in front of a room full of people while smiling the entire time. She corrected my chart notes in red ink and left them on the break room table for everyone to see. She forgot to pass along critical handoff information, then acted stunned when I asked about it in front of the attending physician. She started calling me sweetheart in a tone that made the word feel like an insult, and slowly, the rest of the unit started treating me the same way because it is easier to join the current than to swim against it. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was there for the patients, not for Renata's approval. Most nights, I almost believed it. Room 412 changed everything. Elliot Hargrove was admitted on a Tuesday in March, transferred from a smaller hospital after a second cardiac event in 4 months. I didn't recognize the name at first. I just saw a 71-year-old man with sharp, tired eyes, refusing to let anyone raise the head of his bed because he said it made him feel like he was already being laid out for a funeral. The other nurses knew exactly who he was. Within an hour, half the unit had found an excuse to walk past his room. Elliot Hargrove, founder of a private equity firm most people had never heard of, but that controlled pieces of companies everyone had. A man whose net worth had its own Wikipedia section. A man who, according to the hallway whispers, didn't have a wife anymore, had one daughter he rarely spoke to, and was, depending on who you asked, either a genius or a monster. I didn't treat him like either. I treated him like a patient whose potassium levels were dangerously low and whose hands were shaking too much to hold his own water cup. "You're not going to ask me for anything," he said on my second night with him, watching me adjust his foreline. It wasn't a question. "I'm going to ask you to drink more water," I said. "Everything else is between you and your cardiologist." Something in his face shifted, like he'd been braced for a different answer and didn't know what to do with the one he got. Over the following weeks, Elliot's condition stabilized enough for a step-down transfer, then worsened again, then stabilized again, the way cardiac patients often do, a slow negotiation between the body and time. He requested me specifically for his overnight shifts, which Renata made sure I heard about in the least gracious way possible. "Must be nice," she said, sliding his chart across the counter at me. "Having a rich old man wrapped around your finger." He asked for consistency in his care team, I said. "It's not unusual." "Sure it isn't." I let it go because letting it go was the only tool I had. What I didn't know then was that Renata had already started a private message thread with 2 other nurses, screenshots of which I would only see 5 months later, in a lawyer's office, my stomach turning as I read what they'd written about me while I was still learning how Elliot took his coffee. Elliot Hargrove was not an easy patient. He was demanding, sharp-tongued, and impatient with anyone he suspected of coddling him. But he was never cruel to me, and slowly, in the strange intimacy that exists between a dying man and the person who empties his catheter bag at 3 in the morning, he started to talk. He talked about his company, built from a single failed restaurant loan and a stubborn refusal to quit. He talked about his ex-wife, who he said had loved the version of him that existed before the money and had never quite forgiven him for becoming someone else. And one night, in a voice so quiet I almost missed it, he talked about his daughter, Sabrina. "She thinks I love the company more than I loved her," he said. "The worst part is, for about 15 years, she wasn't wrong." I didn't know, that night, that Sabrina Hargrove would soon become one of the people trying to destroy my life. I only knew that the man in front of me looked, for the first time since I'd met him, genuinely afraid, not of dying, but of running out of time to fix something. By April, Elliot had started asking me strange questions. Did I know a good estate attorney? Did I trust the hospital's notary services? Did I think it was possible for a person to make amends for things they'd done years ago, or whether some mistakes just calcified past the point of repair? I answered honestly, the way I always did. I told him I believed people could change, but that believing it and proving it to the people they'd hurt were 2 very different things. He nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something he already suspected. What I didn't tell him, what I didn't fully understand myself yet, was that someone else in that hospital was watching his visitors more closely than I was, and taking notes for reasons that had nothing to do with his health. That person was Dana Pruitt, the hospital's director of development, the woman in charge of major donor relationships. And Dana had a very specific interest in Elliot Hargrove's money that had started long before I ever stepped into his room. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Thursday night in May, when I found Elliot unusually agitated, flipping through a folder he'd asked his assistant to bring him, muttering to himself about a number that didn't add up. "Everything okay?" I asked, checking his monitor. He hesitated, then held up a printed spreadsheet. The hospital foundation. I gave them $4 million 2 years ago for a new cardiac wing. According to this, less than half of it ever made it into construction costs. I told him, carefully, that I wasn't the right person to ask about hospital finances. He said he knew that. He said he was asking me anyway because I was the only person in the building he trusted not to have an angle. That sentence stayed with me longer than I wanted it to. 2 nights later, Dana Pruitt appeared in Elliot's room for the first time since his admission, all warmth and practiced concern, asking how he was feeling, mentioning how much the hospital valued his generosity, steering the conversation with the fluid confidence of someone who had done this exact routine 100 times. I was adjusting his four-pump when she arrived, and I watched Elliot's expression close over like a door swinging shut. "I'll have my accountant follow up with your office," he told her, in a tone that ended the conversation before it started. After she left, he looked at me for a long moment. "Write down everything I say to you from now on," he said.
"Dates. Times.
Exact words if you can manage it."
Can you do that?"
I told him I could, though I didn't fully understand why he was asking, and I told him something else too because it felt important to say out loud. "Mr. Hargrove, I need you to know I'm not doing this because I want something from you. If you're about to tell me something that involves money, I'd rather you tell your lawyer." He almost smiled. "That," he said, "is exactly why I'm telling you." I started keeping a small notebook in my scrub pocket that night, initially just to humor him. I had no idea I was building the only piece of evidence that would eventually save me. By June, Elliot's condition had worsened enough that his medical team recommended transferring him to the hospital's palliative care floor, a decision he fought for 3 days before finally accepting. Sabrina Hargrove flew in from Boston during that transfer, and it was the first time I met the daughter I'd heard so much about. She was sharp-eyed and guarded in a way that reminded me painfully of her father, and she looked at me the way people look at something they've already decided is a problem. "You're the nurse," she said. Not quite a question. "Maya," I said. I've been caring for your father since March. I know who you are. She said it flatly, and I understood, in that moment, that someone had already told her a version of my story that wasn't the true one. I learned later, from the same lawyer's office where I would eventually learn everything, that Renata Cole had approached Sabrina during a hallway conversation 2 weeks earlier, expressing her concern about how much time I was spending alone with Elliot, how attentive I'd become, how it didn't sit right with the rest of the nursing staff. Renata framed it as a professional worry. It was, in fact, the opening move of something far more calculated, though I wouldn't understand the full shape of it for months. What I noticed in the moment was simply that Sabrina began appearing at odd hours, watching me work with an intensity that had nothing to do with her father's vitals. She asked the other nurses questions about me. She asked Dana Pruitt, of all people, whether the hospital had policies about staff accepting gifts from patients. I hadn't accepted a single gift. I didn't know that detail would matter enormously later, precisely because I hadn't. Elliot, meanwhile, was growing weaker but sharper in a strange way some dying people do, as though the body's failing systems free up something in the mind. Late one night in June, with Sabrina finally asleep in the family room down the hall, he asked me to sit with him. I made a decision, he said, about the company, about the foundation money, about Sabrina. I told him gently that these weren't conversations he needed to have with his nurse. You're the only person who's asked me questions and not answers, he said. Everyone else in my life wants something from the conversation. You just want to know if I'm comfortable.
He paused.
That's rarer than you think, at my level of rich. He told me, that night, 3 things I wrote in my notebook with a shaking hand, not because I understood their significance yet, but because he'd asked me to, and something in his voice told me it mattered. First, he believed Dana Pruitt had been quietly diverting hospital foundation donations into a shell nonprofit she personally controlled, using inflated administrative fee structures that made the fraud difficult to trace on paper. Second, he suspected Renata Cole had a financial relationship with Dana Pruitt, one that involved Renata reporting on donor patients, flagging which wealthy patients seemed close to death, which ones had loose family oversight, which ones were emotionally vulnerable enough to be steered toward giving opportunities. Third, and this was the part that changed my life, though I didn't grasp it that night, he had instructed his attorney to draft an addendum to his will that would place a portion of his estate into an independently governed foundation, one I would have a formal role in overseeing, specifically because I had no financial stake in his death and had never once asked him for anything. I'm not leaving you money because I feel sorry for you, he told me. I'm leaving you responsibility because you're the only person I've met in 5 years who I believe will actually use it the way I intend. I told him I didn't want it. I meant it. I know, he said. That's the only reason it's safe with you. Elliot Hargrove died on a Sunday morning in late July, 3 weeks after that conversation, with Sabrina holding one hand and me adjusting his oxygen on the other side of the bed. His last coherent sentence, spoken to his daughter, was an apology I won't repeat here because it belongs to her, not to the story. His last words to me, an hour before he lost consciousness for the final time, were simpler. Don't let them bury the truth with me. I didn't understand then how literally I would need to take that. The will reading happened 11 days later. I wasn't present. I hadn't even known there was a will reading scheduled until his attorney, a careful, soft-spoken man named Julian Reyes, called me at home and asked if I could come to his office. I assumed it was a formality. A thank you card, maybe. I did not expect Julian to slide a document across his desk showing that Elliot Hargrove had named me co-trustee of a newly created philanthropic foundation funded with $40 million, with instructions that its first mandate was to conduct a full independent audit of Linkvis Memorial's foundation finances. I sat in that office for a long time without speaking. $40 million was a number so large it stopped registering as money and started registering as a kind of danger. He was very specific, Julian told me. He didn't want you to have unrestricted personal access to the funds. He wanted you to have oversight authority, alongside 2 independent board members he selected himself. He said, and I'm quoting him directly, that you were, quote, the only person who'd fight for what the money was supposed to do instead of what it could buy. I asked Julian the question that had been sitting like a stone in my chest since he called. Is this going to destroy my career? He looked at me with something like sympathy. Ms. Whitfield, I think you should prepare yourself for exactly that possibility. Wealthy men leaving money to young female caregivers is one of the oldest stories people love to believe the worst about. Sabrina Hargrove has already retained a litigator to explore contesting the will. He was right. Within 2 days, the story broke, not through any official channel, but through the same person who had started it in a hallway conversation months earlier. Renata Cole told a colleague, who told another colleague, who told a local news blogger who specialized in hospital gossip, that a Lindqvist Memorial nurse had manipulated a dying billionaire into rewriting his will in her favor. By the time the story reached the hospital's HR department, it had grown a second, uglier layer. An anonymous complaint alleging I had violated patient boundary policies by spending excessive unsupervised time with Elliot, accepting undisclosed gifts, and encouraging his estrangement from his daughter for personal gain. None of it was true. All of it was believable, which is a far more dangerous thing. I was placed on administrative leave within a week, pending an internal investigation. My license, my reputation, and 8 years of work were suddenly balanced on the word of people who had built their case against me before I even knew I needed one. The hospital's investigation was led by Dana Pruitt. I found this out from Julian Reyes, who called it either an enormous conflict of interest or something much darker, and by then, I had started to suspect he already knew which one it was. I spent that first week of leave doing the only thing I knew how to do when the world stopped making sense. I organized. I pulled out the notebook Elliot had asked me to keep, transcribed every entry into a typed document with dates, and cross-referenced it against my shift schedule to prove I had never once been unsupervised, with him in the way the complaint implied. Every overnight interaction had occurred with charting timestamps, nurse call logs, and, in several cases, a second nurse present in the room. I called Julian and told him what Elliot had said about Dana Pruitt and Renata Cole. He didn't seem surprised. I need you to understand something, he said. Elliot didn't just leave you oversight of a foundation. 6 weeks before he died, he hired a forensic accountant, quietly through my office, to review Lindqvist Memorial's donor fund. He never told the hospital. He didn't even tell Sabrina. But he told me to give you the report if anything happened to him, before he could act on it himself. The report arrived at my apartment 2 days later in a sealed envelope. What it contained turned my stomach in a way 8 years of trauma cases never had. Over 4 years, Dana Pruitt had funneled roughly $1.8 million in donor contributions, including $600,000 of Elliot's own money, into a separate nonprofit entity called the Lindqvist Community Health Alliance, an organization with no public staff, no verifiable programs, and a registered address that matched Dana Pruitt's home. She had structured it as an administrative partner, charging the hospital foundation escalating fees for services that, according to the forensic report, showed no evidence of ever being performed. And there, in a separate section of the report, was the detail that connected everything: 3 payments totaling $41,000 made from that same shell nonprofit to a personal account belonging to Renata Cole, labeled internally as consulting fees. Renata hadn't just spread a rumor out of jealousy. She had been paid to identify vulnerable, wealthy patients for Dana to target, and when Elliot started asking uncomfortable questions about missing money, Renata's usefulness shifted from identifying opportunities to something else entirely, discrediting the one person Elliot trusted enough to have told the truth to. I sat with that report for a long time before I called Julian back. I want to do this the right way, I told him. I don't want revenge. I want it to be true, provable, and impossible for anyone to spin.
Good, he said.
Because Sabrina Hargrove has scheduled a will contest hearing in 6 weeks, and she's going to argue undue influence. Are you ready to fight it? I told him I was. What I didn't tell him, because I didn't fully believe it myself yet, was that I intended to walk into that hearing and hand Sabrina Hargrove the truth about her father's foundation before her own lawyers found it, because I understood something about her by then that no one else seemed to. She wasn't cruel. She was grieving, and grief had made her easy to point in the wrong direction, the same way Renata's insecurity had made her easy to buy. The hearing took place on a gray Tuesday in September, in a courtroom that felt too small for the amount of money being argued over inside it. Sabrina's attorney opened with exactly the narrative I expected: a lonely, dying man, a young attractive nurse with unrestricted access to his room, a will rewritten in the final weeks of his life, and a suspicious silence from the hospital about how any of it had happened. I sat through 40 minutes of my character being dismantled in careful legal language before Julian finally stood and asked to present evidence. He didn't lead with a forensic report. He led with my notebook, entered as a contemporaneous record, corroborated by nursing shift logs, showing that every private conversation Elliot and I had ever had was, in fact, documented in real time at his explicit request, because he had told me he didn't trust his own household to keep an honest record of his final wishes. Then he entered the forensic accounting report. I watched Sabrina's face change as Julian walked the court through the shell nonprofit, the escalating fees, the $600,000 of her father's own donations quietly diverted, and the $41,000 paid to a hospital nurse named Renata Cole for what the documents euphemistically called patient identification services. "Your Honor," Julian said, "the petitioner's theory is that Ms. Whitfield manipulated a dying man for financial gain. The evidence shows the opposite. Elliot Hargrove identified a genuine fraud being committed against his own charitable giving and structured his estate specifically to ensure someone with no financial motive, someone who explicitly told him, on the record, that she didn't want his money, would have the authority to expose it." Sabrina asked for a recess before cross-examination. When the hearing resumed 2 hours later, her attorney did not call me to the stand. Instead, Sabrina herself asked to speak, addressing the judge directly. "I'd like to withdraw the contest," she said. Her voice shook slightly. "I think I was angry at the wrong person." Outside the courtroom, in the hallway where this story began, she found me before I could leave. "I'm sorry," she said. "I let people tell me who you were instead of finding out myself. That's exactly what I was angry at my father for doing to me, and I did the same thing to you." I told her I understood grief better than most people gave it credit for, and that I didn't need an apology, as much as I needed her to help make sure her father's foundation actually did what he intended. She agreed. 6 weeks later, we sat across from each other at the first board meeting of the Hargrove Foundation for Ethical Healthcare Giving, an organization built with independent audit oversight, transparent reporting requirements, and a founding mandate to investigate exactly the kind of fraud that had almost destroyed both our lives. Dana Pruitt was terminated from Lindqvist Memorial within a week of the forensic report becoming public and was later charged with wire fraud and embezzlement by federal prosecutors. Renata Cole lost her nursing license after a state board investigation confirmed the payments and the pattern of targeting vulnerable donor patients. I never took satisfaction in either outcome the way I thought I might. Mostly, I just felt tired and relieved and a little sad that it had taken so much to prove something that should never have needed proving, that I had simply done my job with kindness, and that kindness had never once required an ulterior motive. I went back to nursing eventually on my own terms at a smaller hospital across the city, where nobody knew my name from the news. I still sit on the foundation board once a month. Sabrina and I have lunch sometimes, and neither of us mentions the hallway anymore. The last entry in the notebook Elliot asked me to keep isn't something he said. It's something I wrote myself the night after the hearing, and I've never crossed it out. He was right. They almost buried the truth with him. But truth, it turns out, is patient. It waits in notebooks and spreadsheets and quiet, careful people for exactly as long as it needs to.